Hi there, I'm Jake from VikingHistory.com. Today, we'll be making a pair of linen braies. Braies were like medieval shorts, but you could probably think of them more like medieval boxer briefs, since they were an undergarment that were worn usually in conjunction with another garment called hose. Hose typically came up to about the knee, or maybe even the mid-thigh, and were made out of wool. The reason that we're making these linen braies is because in another video, we're going to explore how to make hose based on textile fragments that were found at the Hedeby Harbor settlement, which is now modern-day Germany, but was probably Viking Age Denmark. So we've got all of our tools and materials over on our desk. Let's go check them out, and then we'll get started. So let's take a look at the tools that we need. First, we'll need a pencil, a good pair of scissors, some needles for hand stitching, a soft tape measure, some thread, our actual fabric, and then I've got a couple pairs of pants here that we'll talk about in just a minute that's going to help us as sort of a guide or a pattern on how to create these pair of pants. And then a way to draft up our pattern, we've got a big piece of green heavy cardstock. One thing I'd like to mention is I'll be using this thread, which is Gutermann 100% polyester thread. And the color number is 506. I wouldn't recommend using polyester thread as it's not exactly historical. It would be better to use 100% linen thread, especially if it's waxed, because it will make it easier to hand stitch these garments. However, I did have this thread laying around, and it is a really good color match for our 100% linen. The other thing worth mentioning is that I've got quite a bit of linen here. We're only going to need to use about a half a yard to 3/4 of a yard. So about just under a half to just under 3/4 of a meter of fabric. The reason I have so much is because I'll be making a linen undertunic in another video. You can see I've also got another pair of pants already here. This is a pair of wool pants based on the Torsberg trousers. We're actually going to use these to make our pant pattern. You can also see that I've got another pair of linen trousers here. We can use these as a guide as well. If you don't already have a pair of early medieval pants that you've made before or that someone has made for you, you can even just use a pair of modern pants like khakis or jeans, really just to get the shape of the leg. So you can see I've already got my measurement laid out, but because of the bright green color of this paper, the camera was having a little bit of difficulty picking it up. So I just went ahead and traced that out in Sharpie so that you could see it. Now, in order to get our measurements for this pattern, first we're going to begin with the knee. So you're just going to take a measurement of right around the knee if that's where you'd like your braies to sit, or just below the knee if your braies are going to be a little bit longer. Next, we'll measure around the upper thigh, right under the groin. The last piece we'll measure around the waist. Now remember, you want your braies to sit somewhere right around your typical pant line, because usually you wear a belt with your braies in order to suspend the hose that go over them. Okay, so now we've got both of our leg pieces, and as you saw, all I did was take the pattern that I made from a single pant leg, but only half because it was folded in half. And I put these measurements on there from when I took my measurements of my waist, my upper thigh, and my knee. And all I really did was cut those measurements in half. So say if you have a measurement of 24, it's going to be 12 inches across for your pattern. And then all you do is flip the pattern over, making sure that you actually flip it in the exact middle spot, and then you have a full pant leg. I did this because this piece of card paper that I had was actually too small to make a full leg pattern. But if you do have a larger piece of like drafting paper or maybe even a piece of cardboard, you can make a larger pattern and you don't have to cut it down the middle. But it's just what I chose to do. Okay, so now that we've got both of our pant legs, what we need to focus on is the gusset in the middle, which is actually the groin piece. So this goes up underneath from your front belt side to the back, around your butt to the back of your belt side. One thing that is important to note, however, is that because of the shape of these individual pant leg pieces, when we actually fold this over and sew up this seam to make the pant leg, this is the area that the groin piece will fold into and be sewn to. So it needs to actually be at least twice this length. In other words, you're going to sew one end along this seam, and then it's going to fold and sew up this seam. So it needs to be at least twice this length. So after having gone back with my soft tape measure and measuring both this pattern and the pieces that I cut out and on existing pants that I currently have, I've determined that this measurement is about 16 inches or a little over 40.5 centimeters. So this inseam piece is going to be doubled for 32 inches in total length for the gusset piece that will stitch into the middle. Now I've decided I don't want just a strip of rectangular fabric. I want it to actually be a little bit more tailored, but still a little baggy. So what I'm actually going to do is make this measurement up top. This is the area that's closest to my navel, so it's the front part of the waistband area right up here. I'm going to make this only about 4 inches across. Then down here, closer to the crotch area, this is going to be a little bit wider. I'm actually going to make this about 6 inches across. The reason for that is when I've done some types of Viking reenactment fighting in the past, or different games at events and festivals, this area undergoes a lot of pressure when you do some type of split or lunge motion, and a lot of stress is put right on these seam joints and they usually break. So what I'm going to do is 4 inches up here, 6 inches in the middle, and then back up on the underside, so the seat of my pants where my butt is, on the other side will be 8 inches. So this will actually be more of a trapezoidal shape when we cut out the piece of fabric. But as we wrap it around, it'll have a lot more room in the back for my butt, some room here for moving and flexing, and then a little bit more trim fit up at the front where the belt will be. Okay, so you can see that I've cut out this piece. It's sort of like a trapezoid or a tapering piece where we have 4 inches at the end, 6 inches at the middle, and 8 inches at the other end. So as I've said before, we've got our 2 pieces for each of the legs here, and then of course we've got our gusset that goes in the middle, and now it's time to go hit the sewing machine. So basically what we're going to do is sew this pant leg down this seam here, and then sew each of these seams to either these seams up here to create a connection to this gusset, and then we're going to do the same thing for the left or the right leg, whichever other leg that may be, and we'll end up with a full set of basically like really big sort of baggy shorts. We're here at the sewing machine. We've got everything threaded and set up and ready to start going. I've got a towel here just so I don't scratch the countertop with my really old Singer sewing machine. This is a really strong machine, and we're going to use this to sew up our linen braies. Okay, so as you can see, we finished the construction portion of these linen braies. You can see they're kind of baggy, they're very roomy, very narrow strip of the gusset up at the top, and then towards the back, it's actually a little bit wider, which gives us the best part. We can squat down really low, and we don't have to worry about these seams down here on the inside of the legs, or even these inseams ripping or popping if we do any type of really wide movements, if we're fighting or taking part in games at some festival or event. So I'm really happy with the way that these came out, and there's just a few more things that we have to get done for these to be finished. Now I'm here at my window just because I've got a lot of sunlight so that you're able to see exactly what I'm doing, because it is kind of fine needlework and a little bit small, and because the thread really matches very well with the fabric. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm cleaning up the hem of one of these pant legs. This would be the outside, and then this is the inside, the part that's would be resting against my leg right in here. You can see that I've already done some of that hem work on the machine, but I'm now going back and doing it by hand because I want this hand stitched look on the outside. One thing to note is that the way that I'm getting this seam to lay down really nice and flat is I'm using a whip stitch, and I'll show you what that looks like. So the whip stitch essentially is going from the outside inward. I'm going through the top of this seam. If we can get that a little bit closer. You can see that's just through the edge of this seam. And I pull that tight. But then I'm inserting my needle actually at the bottom of this lip. Not through it, but just underneath. And coming out the other side, and then continuing this process all the way around. And what that's actually going to do is on the outside, it gives us this sort of like running stitch appearance where all of the stitches are roughly about the same size and they continue in more or less a straight line. But on the inside, the part that's resting against my leg, this seam down here, because it's pinned down with this whip stitch, it's very hard to pull it up, as you can see. I can't even do that with my thumb. And you can see how thin this thread is. So that thread's really holding that down, and it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to make that really nice and flat, but it's also going to keep the linen from fraying. And that's why we're doing the hems this way. Linen is something that really likes to fray quite a bit, which is why I've actually done this hem stitch already on the machine, just to make it easier for myself as I'm working on it, even with the hand stitching. But this whip stitch is a documented stitch that was used in a number of different places, particularly Hedeby. And we're making these braies to go along with the hose that we're trying to reproduce from the Hedeby Harbor find. So I thought it would be a good stitch to use. Another thing that you can do that's optional is to add some extra strips that you can use as belt loops for the braies. I've got this belt here that I've cut out of really thin cowhide leather, rather than buying an actual belt blank, because sometimes from different stores like Tandy Leather or other local leather supply shops, they can be quite thick, and because these braies are going to be sitting pretty close to my body, and I'll likely be wearing another woolen tunic over a linen under tunic, and then maybe a belt on top of that as well. It's going to be a lot of layers. So what I opted to do was create this really simple belt, and when these braies are finished, I'll show you exactly how I'm going to use this belt and how it fastens. But for right now, I just wanted to show you the type of strips that I cut out for the belt loops. I wanted them to be quite wide, so what I ended up doing was cutting a big square piece out, but I doubled it over because I wanted it to be actually extra thick, just to be a little bit more durable. And I'm going to fold them over, and then I haven't really decided yet if I'm going to leave the belt loops to be that size or if I'm going to double them over again just to make them extra thick. But the intention here is that I'll have 6 of these belt loops that will be placed around the waistline of the braies. So probably what I'm going to do is actually put these on the machine and sew them up, and then maybe actually turn them inside out so that you don't see that seam, and then maybe just hand stitch over them and do the same thing for the tops and the bottoms. and then I will probably attach them directly onto the waistband area so that I'll be able to pass a belt right through them. So again, there'll be 6 of them. This is optional. It depends on how you actually want to wear this garment, what you might be wearing it with. Again, I've got this thin leather belt here that I'm going to be using to suspend the hose from. So I'm going to make sure that I have that included. And yep, I'll get these all done and show you what they look like afterwards. So what I ended up doing for these belt loops is I ended up taking those wide strips of cloth that I had shown before, and I sewed them together. You can see here. I sewed them together on the machine right at this hem, leaving about a half to maybe even almost 3/4 of an inch of seam allowance. And then what I did was I turned them inside out and I ironed them, so you can see how nice and flat that came out. And then I folded them over again, stitched again along this seam, and then turned that inside out, and I ended up with this. This is what I'm going to use for my belt loop. There's not a whole lot of historical evidence for belt loops on linen garments like these pair of Braies, but there is examples of some on the Torsberg trousers and some other leg garments. Usually they're a little bit narrower, but what I wanted to do was provide a way for this belt to wrap around the waistband of this garment and feel somewhat flat and secure and not too bulky. I really didn't want to notice these when I'm wearing other garments over them, but at the same time I really wanted it to be durable and thicker because this is quite a thin fabric. I mean, you can see the light shining through from the other side. So what I decided to do is just leave them this way, and there's only 6 of them, so I'm going to place them pretty evenly around the waistband. And because this leather belt is actually quite narrow, it fits through here pretty easily. So I think this is going to be a really good option. And again, this is optional depending on how you'd like to wear these, what other garments you'd like to wear them with. So I'm going to finish sewing the rest of these up, and we'll put it all together and I'll show you what it looks like after. For this portion of hand stitching, I am using a much thicker needle, and I am using this very bleached white linen thread. I'm not crazy about the color, but it is what I had on hand, and you can see that the stitching does look pretty good, and the actual contrast between the colors of the thread and the fabric is not too different. It is fine to use differentiating colors in your thread versus your fabric, because it did happen in the Viking Age. But for these undergarments, I'm just sticking with very neutral colors. But I do like this thread because it is a bit thicker and it is waxed, so it makes it bind to the fabric a little bit better as I go. So this is probably a better thread to actually be using for this project, but I do think that what we used to do the inside and all of the machine stitching as well, that was a fine thread to use. Alright, so here's our finished pair of Braies, and I'd love to give you a close-up of how they actually turned out, especially the belt loops, since we didn't do too much close-up on the finished outcome of that. And I'd also like to show you how the belt fixture actually comes together, because I know that I talked a little bit about this, but I'd like to demonstrate that a little bit more. So I did want to go over how the belt is actually fixed to the Braies, and then how the hose would actually fix themselves to the belt, and then how the belt is tied. So you can see the belt loops that I put on. I had mentioned that they're quite a bit wider. And these actually go through the folded part of the belt loop. So you can see it's not actually right against the Braies. Instead, there's still a little bit of extra fabric in between the belt and my waist, which I think actually lends to being a little bit more comfortable of a fit. And I think that the belt isn't pressing too hard against my hips and actually causing any type of discomfort if I were to wear these for a long period of time. You'll also notice that this belt doesn't have a buckle. It's sort of taken as an idea from some sword scabbards that are seen during the early medieval period. And so it's really just a knot system that actually keeps the belt fastened. So what you do is you just gather up the belt and the pair of braies, and you've got the tail end in, I guess, perhaps your dominant hand. I'm a right-handed person, so I've got this in my right hand, and I feed it through the loop and pull tight. And then what I do is I keep my finger on the loop to maintain that same level of tension where I'd like to keep the pants. And then I tuck this loose end up through, but I don't pull it tight. I leave this loop here because what I'm actually going to do is take this little bit of the tail and poke it back down through the loop that I just made, effectively tying a knot with this working end of the belt, the leather, through this standing loop. So you've got the original loop, you go through, create a loop, and then tuck the tail back down through. And it fastens pretty well. It definitely keeps the pants up, which is an important thing because these braies are going to be what we use to suspend the hose from, which will come up to about here, and then have a strip of leather that will go up to the belt and then tie on there as well. Well, thanks for joining us. That's it for today's video. If you found this information helpful, consider giving us a like or share with your medieval-minded friends. Consider subscribing if you'd like to see more from our channel, and if there's something that you think we could have done better, or a new topic you'd like to see in another video, let us know in the comments below. We'll also be sure to link this video and all the other videos in this series into a playlist so that you can watch through and make all of these garments along with us to add them to your Viking persona. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.